Thank you all so much for being here. We have an amazing panel. I want to first off start by saying Happy Black History Month. Clearly, this is a conversation that goes beyond Black History Month, right? And I am beyond thrilled to have you all with me, just to have a conversation about some of the inequities, what you all are seeing in the classroom, whether that is in person or virtually, and just having an open and honest conversation about you all as Black educators. And so I wanted to start off this conversation by talking a little bit about who we even have on this panel, which is amazing. So I'm just going to try and swing to who I see first. Let's start with Leanne Richardson. Leanne, she is a Kansas City, Kansas public school, high school science teacher. We have Jermaine Thompson. He is an English teacher for the Pembroke Hill Upper School. We have Tara Haskins, who is the principal and one of the founders of Kansas City Girls Preparatory Academy. And then we have George Jefferson. He is a fourth grade teacher at University Academy. We have Miss Deidre Anderson, and she is with United Intercity Services, and that is home to 3 early childhood education centers. So you have Metro, you also have St. Mark, and then North Centers as well. And then we have Samara Herrera, and Samara is the Director of Community Partnerships with School Smart Kansas City. And we can't forget about LaCrystal McKnight. LaCrystal is a special education teacher in the Shawnee Mission School District. So many different types of schools on both sides of the state line. So let's just go ahead and dive into it. One of the first things, and side note, this is live on Facebook. So if you all have any questions for anyone that is watching live, please feel free to comment in the comment section below with your questions. Hopefully we can get those answered. So I want to start off with data. And I want to start off with this slide. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. Can you all see it okay? Okay, great. So this is KCPSS performance. And what this is that KC Education System Performance and Equity Review by School Smart Kansas City. And this is recent, as of December of 2020. The blue that you see there, that's the state of Missouri, the proficiency levels, and this is all grades. The yellow is KCPSS, which stands for the Kansas City Public Schools System. So that means it's KCPS and the charters within its boundaries. To the far right is the latest data, 2019. And it shows that there's a 16% difference between KCPSS as well as the state level, 45% versus 29%. And a lot of these, this is, and I want to show something else as well. And Samara, I'm going to ask you the first question. This is another slide from this review. When it comes to KCPSS, this is the English, language arts, and math combined. You can see that this data that we're seeing, the bottom 5% of schools, all the schools today in the bottom 5% are at least 90% low income, 90% Black in student population, or at least 90% minority students. So Samara, I kind of want to have that conversation with you because you're looking at all of this data. When you see that looking at all of these schools, bottom 5%, 90% low income, or at least 90% Black students, what do those conversations look like when you are talking with those educators?
Oh, that's a heavy question out of the gate. I think that, anytime you look at that, it's a staggering, right? Data can be incredibly staggering. But I do believe that data, kind of to take a favorite quote of mine and kind of turn it on its head, is a place of reference, but not a place of resonance, right? So in looking at that system level perspective and what is happening, particularly for our students of color, our students with disabilities, our students who speak different languages, right, is this incredible gap. But what it does offer is the realm of possibility for the variety of different ways that we can combat that. And so, I try and approach any conversation with a spirit of hope, right, a spirit of joy, in even in the midst of overwhelming data that shows that we could be doing so much better by kids, right? And what I think is also staggering when you just think about the state of Missouri, right? We're not talking about a state that has done overwhelmingly well in comparison to other states across the United States, right? So just wanting our kids to meet that state average is not enough, right? We should want exceedingly more for our students. And so oftentimes when I talk about data, it's just a departure point. It's here's what we know and what can we do.
And Deidre, I kind of want to ask you the next question. When you see this data, because I'm sure you've seen a lot of data, especially when it comes to early childhood education, are you surprised by it? And what are those conversations with the families when it comes to this?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not surprised by the data. I'm actually a former K-12 administrator, and so I'm really grateful to be on the front end working with children long before they're entering the K-12 system. Ironically, we are very committed to race and equity at United Intercity Services, and we host monthly conversations on building relationships by breaking down walls of racial division. This last month, our forum was focused on putting a spotlight on preschool suspension and expulsion rates, like preschool and suspension and expulsion rates. The fact that we're even letting that roll off our tongue is mind-boggling to me. Who would suspend or expel a preschool student? Black girls actually fare the worst in those rates. They are suspended and expelled at alarming rates, significantly higher. So about 18% of the national preschool population is Black females, but they account for 53% of the suspension and expulsion rates. And this is from public preschool programs. And we know that public preschool programs are primarily for low-income students, which are predominantly enrolled by children of color. And so if we don't begin to think about this long before kids go into kindergarten, it just magnifies, snowballs, and becomes much bigger. 90% of our brain is developed before age 3. What we're doing in preschool is essential, but the fact that as a nation, we can't figure out how to fund that, even though we know that is absolutely what families need in order to not just survive, but to thrive into the future. And so I think that when I looked at that data, I think we also need to highlight this is not just Kansas City. Actually, the state average went down more, and the local average in the Kansas City region went up. So the gap did close some, definitely is not acceptable rates. But why in Missouri we still continue to use the MAP test as our standard of achievement when we know nationally it is a far more rigorous assessment? We've got to do better. And I'll say one last thing. I was on a call today with the governor's office and some state officials talking about the governor's new announcement of the Office of Childhood, which organizes and synthesizes all early childhood resources and elevated this issue of equity. And I'm going to keep doing that. And because we don't even want to disaggregate the data, it's very difficult to even get real information about how children of color are performing in our state, because that data is very difficult to get people to release to the public.
Thank you for sharing that, Deidre. I actually want to touch on Tara a little bit. We can't talk about this past school year without talking about COVID and the impact that it has had on several schools. When I talked to you last July, your school actually sits on the east side, 3rd district. We know that during that time, it was showing the most positive COVID-19 cases. And I actually want to read just a quick statistic. During that time, the COVID tracking projects stated Black people made up 12% of the state of Missouri. Yet they made up 29% of positive COVID cases and 35% of deaths. And when I talked to you, Tara, you had talked about, it's disheartening. It was upsetting to hear that because this is a place where your families live, and you had mentioned you have a commitment to your families. How have you all shown that commitment since the last time I talked to you? And how do you continue to show that commitment when this pandemic clearly has increased even more? Those cases have increased, those deaths have increased even more.
I will say that the main commitment that we've honored is love and relationships. Told families and even our staff, if that is the only thing we get right this year, that a scholar and families feel loved and that they feel safe, then we are just far beyond anything we could have ever imagined, while still honoring the commitment to families that your child will learn. Like learning may look different for them this year. Their growth may look different for them this year. Even me as a principal, I sit and I'm like, we're growing. I know it's not at the rate that I want us to grow, but we're growing in the right direction. And I think one of the things is also maintaining like communication with families. They know their child better than I ever could. The moment we notice something different, we're calling. We're maintaining bi-weekly communication from any teacher in the school. And we're genuinely asking, hey, this is what we're noticing. What are you seeing? What can we do to help? And I think that's making sure that scholars feel like, oh, my teacher sees me. Oh, my teacher notices me. My teacher sees me when I'm doing great, but they see when I need help. Because oftentimes our kids at this age, they ask for help in different ways. A phenomenal team member at our school always says behavior is a language. So we're noticing those behaviors and we're asking ourselves, what are they saying? Or what do we think they're saying? And we're making sure we're connecting with families so that we don't have assumptions and we're not writing false stories about our families because they know more so than us. And I think that's just the main thing that we keep at the forefront, love in those relationships.
Speaking of being seen, and I want to definitely keep this open to you, Tara, and also to you as well, LaCrystal. Because LaCrystal, when I talked to you a few months ago, you said, I really want to make sure my Black and Brown students are being seen, which is so important, especially when it came to the protests, the murder of George Floyd. Breonna Taylor's name was being highlighted and talked about, racial injustice. And it's interesting, Kansas City Girls Preparatory Academy, one of your team members had mentioned, not only are we dealing with a COVID pandemic, we're also dealing with a racial pandemic while still teaching our students. So LaCrystal, let's start with you. You know, what does that look like being there and showing up for your students, for your Black and Brown students, but also showing up for yourself as a Black educator during this time?
I think the most important thing that's been helpful for me is to have supportive administrators. In the building that I'm in, my administrators are Caucasian, but they have made every effort to make all of our African-American staff, our Black students, our Brown students feel safe, as well as our staff. They've taken the time to highlight and talk to the staff about the incidents that have occurred over the past year. One of the huge things that happened was the insurrection at the Capitol. That next morning, we had an email in our inbox as staff members saying, we know that this is hard, we know that this is heavy. Take the time you need to have the appropriate conversations to make sure your students feel safe. They're not shying away from the incidents that are occurring. They are addressing it straightforward. Our school's also having opportunities for our staff members to have coffee and conversations about race, equity, elections, tough topics. And we're doing that for the staff members because the self-care for staff is important. But then we're also identifying staff members that feel comfortable having those conversations with students and giving teachers phrases that they can use to talk about those things with students. I think that that's important. A lot of times in schools, we shy away from these topics because they're controversial. When our kids need an outlet, they need to talk to us. We are with them more hours of the day than their families are. We need to give them the opportunity to share what they're feeling, what they're experiencing. So we've been working really hard as a school and as a district to provide those, we're calling them safe spaces, and transitioning from safe spaces to brave spaces. So we're really working hard to make sure that we're allowing our students to be themselves, be heard, feel comfortable, feel safe, and then providing opportunities for our staff members as well. And I think both of those are key.
Absolutely. Derek, you want to touch on that a little bit?
I think with that in mind, it's important to recognize that our Black students, it's different when people can read about it. Imagine our Black students who experience it and live it, and our staff members who experience it and live it. And I think it's important to recognize it's sometimes harder to get in front of your kids when you're still processing these feelings yourself. And so with the many things that have happened this year, one thing that we keep true in our school for our staff and our scholars, something called Circle, where it's a time a week that we hold very sacred in our school. Adults come together, how are you feeling? And we check in with each other. And it's a protocol, it's a system, but that space where you can bring up what's coming up for you. Our scholars have that same opportunity twice a week, going back to making sure we're not writing stories for them. That is a time where they get to write their story and share and connect. And I think with the many of things, pick one that has happened in our country. One thing that we've even given scholars, we give teachers the tools. Like, here are things that you can say. Here are things that you could use with scholars to fill their background knowledge, because kids don't know what's going on. They just want to know, why does the world treat me this way? Or why is this happening? And we make sure we build the historical knowledge with our scholars. We are just, when we think about being an anti-racist school, first thing is making sure they know the history. Here's why it is a surprise it's happening. Here's why it's not. But even giving our scholars a choice, hey, do you want to talk about this today? Letting the scholars collectively choose yes or no. If yes, teachers have the tools. If no, great, we'll go on to this. And I think that's one thing we also need to ask our scholars. Are they in a space to talk about it? We can't assume for them, but a lot of them will tell you yes or no, and they know what they want. They don't know how to get there, but they know what they want. And it's our job as teachers and educators to just create the space for the outcome that they know they want.
Jermaine, I want to get your thoughts as well, because you're a teacher, you are a writer, you're a poet, and you talk a lot about race and politics and religion. How are you incorporating that in your experience, as well as your upbringing as an educator, as a Black educator?
Well, I told my students that I'll never pretend like the world isn't happening in the classroom. And being an American Lit teacher for my juniors, it's always easy to have some conversations. So when January 6th happened, my first instinct was to try to show them that this isn't abnormal, like to break that headline of this isn't who we are as a country. So we've been reading Baldwin, we've been reading Audre Lorde and Alice Walker and all of these other Black voices who have this insight into who we are as a nation. And I want them to understand that there is no, like Tara said, that language is a behavior, and that there's so many ways that we communicate. As a Black man at a predominantly white school, my students have mentioned that some of the things we talk about have more credibility because they come from me, as opposed to another teacher who doesn't look like me. So I think I just try to make sure that what I'm teaching them actually has not value just only for me, but for them as well in their own growth as citizens of the world, of Kansas City, or wherever they might be living in at the moment.
That's great, Jermaine, thank you. And speaking of that, not only are we seeing a teacher shortage, we're seeing a minority teacher shortage. And I definitely want to bring in George Jefferson to the conversation, because George, the other day, we were talking about how important representation was. And if you kind of wouldn't mind telling and sharing your story of not fitting the mold and how excited your boys get when they see you, if you wouldn't mind touching on that.
Yes. So growing up, my story was I came from a relatively diverse area in Southern California. And when I stepped into the classroom, I didn't struggle so much when it came to the academics, but when it came to finding my place and understanding like who I was, there was a lot of tension there. And particularly when it came to my penmanship. So anyways, growing up, like going through the school system, I got from teachers and students every year, if you can't write neater, you're not going to make it to the next grade. And that continued, you're not going to make it to college, so on and so forth. Well, that translated because the whole time, like subconsciously, what I was getting from these teachers was, you couldn't do my job. You couldn't stand up here and you couldn't educate students because you don't fit the cookie cutter mold. You don't have the penmanship. Unconscious, like without being said, you don't have the skin tone. And that wasn't so much the intentionality that was coming from the teachers. That's not what the teachers wanted to get across, but that's what I got as a young man. And so when I teach my students, when I stand in front of my students, the main thing that I want them to understand is that you are unique. You're an individual, and that there's a lot of things that you do really well and that add value. I think that representation is important in the classroom because a lot of these conversations don't happen. And a lot of times they don't need, how do I put this? A lot goes on, like we said earlier, through the behaviors, through what we see, through mannerisms, through the people who are in the spaces. So if you don't see yourself in a space, it's hard for you to imagine that possibility. And if you're not showing possibilities, it's hard for you to manifest them in a lot of ways. And so I think it's really powerful for us to show our kids the world, show our kids who we are, what it means to be Black, the rich culture, the rich history behind it, beyond just the icons and the history that we repeat year after year.
I love what you had said when you were talking about Black men don't fit this particular mold. There are so many complexities when it comes to being a Black man, when it comes to being a Black male educator. And I actually want to read you something, George, because yesterday I talked with a parent whose child was your student a couple of years ago. And she said, having Mr. Jefferson as an educator, it's been great seeing my son, she has 2 sons, in those spaces. She saw her son opening up more to Mr. Jefferson, to things he was dealing with. He respected him as a Black man in that space, something to aspire to. And it felt like he belonged. In that space, it felt like he belonged. Whereas in school, you should always feel like you belong, right? But in that space, he felt like he belonged. And she didn't really see that, but she saw how necessary it was. And she said, it felt so great to see my son be authentically who he was because of my teacher, Mr. Jefferson. And I guess her other son was on your football team, like you were a coach. And so to hear that, and I really want to talk to the teachers in the room, to hear that, knowing that you are making a difference when sometimes it may not feel like it. What goes on in your head when you hear that?
It's much needed. I think it kind of fuels the fire because it's a thankless job, and we're not always asking for thank yous. That's not what we're out for, but we do want to know that we're making an impact. We do want to know that we can keep going fast in the direction that we're going, and that the kids are coming with us, and that we are modeling future leaders of tomorrow, because our kids get up in the morning and they see the same things going on in this country as we do. And they have a lot of questions, and they have a lot of harsh realities that they're facing that are counter to some of the feel-good stories that I remember hearing growing up. Right now it's out and it's in front of you. It's in front of everyone, put it that way. It's in front of a lot of people every day, but it's in front of everyone. And kids are wondering, how do we change this? And so it's great when we're making that kind of an impact that lasts and that they can take with them.
Can I just say, I'm over here snapping and clapping and tapping my feet, because y'all are like unicorns, Mr. Thompson, Mr. Jefferson, because by ensuring that a student belongs, they feel seen, they feel represented, they feel heard, right? You're moving mountains, right, when it comes to curriculum then, right? Like it just opens that door, right? And that just, okay, I had to put on makeup. I'm not gonna cry up on here.
You got it.
No, I agree. And if I could piggyback off of what she's saying too, if you're just looking on this screen right now, as far as educators that we all are, how diverse we are, 2 to 5, 2 men to 5 women. We know seeing men, especially men of color in this field, is rare. And so that in and of itself speaks volumes to kiddos when they see someone who looks like them, someone that they can relate to, and not just, I know you're, Mr. Jefferson, you're a coach, but not just as a coach. You know, we equate athletics and seeing you out on the field, but then there's Mr. Thompson who's in the classroom who can teach me how to write and how to read. And so that is just important for our boys to see someone who looks like them, who's educated, who do make them feel like they belong. So I want to piggyback off of that, Samara. I agree. I agree.
I love that. We actually do have a, go ahead, George, you had something to say?
Yes, I really appreciate those words. And it's a two-way street. I think that Black men have to make sure that we're supporting our sisters in the building. Kids need to see that collaboration. They need to see that excellence. And then they need to experience like that genuine like kinship and support. So I appreciate everything y'all do as well.
Love that. We actually have a Facebook question. This is from Maxine. This is for LaCrystal. How much active engagement has been set up with the parents of the students? LaCrystal, if you want to touch on that, or any teachers want to touch on that.
I think that this year, this school year has been like none other. And I think that similar to what Tara said, starting last spring in our school district, we made efforts to connect with parents every week, to touch base, to check on parents through phone calls, through text messages, just to check in on families, not academic related, but just social emotional well-being. I think that this school year, especially for our Black students, we are working really hard to just make sure that our Black and our Brown students are included, that their families have opportunities. Our district created a diversity, equity, and inclusion coordinator position in the last couple of years. We've created diversity practitioners, and I serve on that committee. There are 25 of us for the district that get training through Deep Equity Core One program. We are working on training teachers to make sure that we're all seeing and hearing our students. So our district's doing a lot to ensure that our students are heard and seen and that they're included. They've created new policies for parents to report situations or things that they don't feel comfortable about or things they want to see changed. I think that that's a big thing. I think one of the biggest things that we can do with parents is making sure that parents have an outlet and they know who to contact when they have things going on. That's something I think that's missing in education. I think that we all see the inequities that are happening in education for our Brown and Black students, but I don't think that there's always been a direct, this is what you do when this happens and this is how we can address it and make change happen. So that's something that our district has recently been working on. And I just think that making sure that parents see us as Black educators, all the parents need to see us, know that they can reach out to us. I specifically work in special education, so I work with a smaller population, but I connect with all the Black students at my school. I do check-ins with lots of students. I think it's so important that our students see people that look like them and care for them, because they don't see us a lot or enough at our schools. So.
Crystal.
I think that the pandemic sort of forced schools to do what parents had been wanting them to do all along, which was be more responsive and open to them. I think that many schools are kind of designed as fortresses, like drop your kid off and be on demand for when I need you to be on supply. You know what I mean? Like we don't want, most schools, in my experience, even as a parent and a grandparent, when we come up making more demands of schools to do things that are more responsive to our children, there's a different response that you get than showing up for the parent-teacher conference that they schedule, that has their agenda and their plan, versus being open and inviting and welcoming. One of the things that, you know, if I could do it all over again in the K-12 setting, I would set up the environment to be like it is in a preschool setting. Parents have to come in the building. Somebody in the family comes in the building in the morning and in the afternoon. So don't tell me you can't have a meaningful conversation with a parent or a relative in the family, because there's somebody in the building every day. And that's not the way a lot of schools were designed. But with the pandemic, parents obviously are not coming in the building, kids are not coming in the building. So you had to learn to recognize and relate to parents differently and students differently. And hopefully schools have learned some things. And there's a lot of judgment passed on families without an understanding of I look like an unavailable parent. That's because I'm trying to run 3 other schools myself. And so it doesn't mean that I don't care. It doesn't mean that I'm not engaged and don't know what's going on. It just means I'm not available during the school day to talk to you because I'm trying to run other schools. And I think if we lose that judgment and begin to really see parents as valued partners in their children's education, you'd see a lot change. And one thing on representation, even in our preschools, the literature we have in the classrooms, the dolls, they're representative of the children we serve. You know, from all nations, languages, for Black children, for Latina children, trying to ensure that there is something that's representative of who they are, on top of the fact that we want the educators to look like them and embody a spirit that they can relate to as well.
I spoke to an English teacher was someone going to talk? I apologize.
It was me, but I was just gonna say just one little thing. But I think we talk about representation mattering to our students of color, but it also needs to matter to our white students and our white colleagues as well, right? Because, you know, I think about the story, Mr. Jefferson, you just told about what, you know, was, you know, indirectly being communicated to you, right, by teachers and educators, administrators who didn't look like you. Perhaps they had never interacted with a teacher who looked like you or taught like you, and that, you know, that gets translated as well. And so the barriers, I mean, I think it goes both ways, and it does a great deal to break down the walls on both sides, right? It changes the narrative about Black students, Black leaders, Black educators in education when you can walk in the room and say, see, there's somebody that teaches like me, that, you know, I'm not just the football coach, right? Or I'm not just the in-school suspension, you know, moderator or whatever. I am the teacher. I'm duly qualified to be in this space, and what I have to offer, you need to hear, not just for Black students, but for all students.
I love that point, Samara. And I kind of want to bring in Leanne to this conversation. You know, we were talking about diversity training and making sure that there was more diversity when it comes to leadership in education. Leanne, talk a little bit about the importance of that and what you're seeing as an educator in terms of that.
Well, what I'm seeing when you think of leadership in education, of course, like on here, you think about the principals, you think about the directors, you think about the ICOs, but teachers are leaders too. The custodian that cares is a leader as well. So is that food service worker, the people who are in the hallways and have their boots on the ground. Each and every last one of them are leaders. They contribute to the success of our students in their own way. And so a lot of times when we think about leadership, we think in the terms of that hierarchy of the principal or the superintendent. One thing that I can say that I commend my district on is grooming leaders from within. And so we hear a lot about, you know, people getting their foot in the door, maybe starting out as a paraprofessional and getting some experience underneath their belt. But then we have programs where we build on that expertise that they learn into the classroom and get them certified and the certification. So then that paraprofessional then becomes the teacher. And then that teacher can then train to become the instructional coach. And so that teacher now is a coach of other teachers. And that's one thing I can say that I really admire about my school district is training within. And that allows for that diversity to have people in the building who look like the kids that we serve, just in a different way. Everyone may not have went to a 4-year college and got their certification, but there's still other ways to make an impact in education. And so that's why it's important to remember that leaders, the bus driver, that the first people who see, the first people who see, what happened to do not disturb? That did not work. The first people that my kiddos see, is that bus driver. Yeah. Sorry about that. I guess that's my kids. They want to be on TV too. Okay, I'm going to leave that alone. I'm going to leave that alone. But again, those bus drivers, they're leaders. They're the first people that our kids see in the morning. And so it's important for them to be educated just as well as anybody else. So diversity is important. Our kids need to see people who look like them. And here in my district, we're, inner city. It's a commitment that we have to have the people who work in our district look like the people we serve. And so that is a commitment that I know our district has. And so we're always looking for people of color to come help educate our kiddos.
Jermaine, were you going to say something?
I don't think so.
You went off mute, so I wasn't sure if you were going to add on to that or not.
I'm sorry. I know it was off mute, but I wasn't going to say anything.
Well, I was going to touch on, maybe curriculum. What is some of the curriculum that we are incorporating when it comes to making sure that we're seen, making sure, I say we, I am not an educator, making sure that you all as Black educators are seen, as Black and Brown students are seen as well. So Jermaine, if you want to start, kind of what we see in your curriculum.
I can touch on that. All right, so my last year curriculum, I made sure to include all Americans with hyphens in their identity. So we began, the summer reading was from a white gentleman who wanted, his premise was his life was too boring, so he had to go find adventure with Native Americans. So our next text was by a Native American author. Then we went to Chinese American, then Japanese American, then African American. Right now, our summer reading for my juniors was A Tradition by Jericho Brown. It's a book of poetry that interrogates whiteness. For my freshmen, we've read Clap When You Land, which is a book that interrogates identity. Are you able to claim a place you haven't been? One of the narrators is Dominican, but she lives in New York. But she has a sister she doesn't know about who lives in the Dominican Republic, who is Dominican, and she's fairer skinned and has curlier hair. But the one in New York is darker skinned. So we got a conversation about colorism with my freshmen. So, so all of these ideas we get early and often. I try to make sure that all of my students get to have these conversations and engage with these things we're all dealing with, because they're not having these conversations outside of the class. So let's bring them inside the classroom and try to express ourselves in a constructive way, and just say what you want to say and get a grade for it.
I'm like chuckling because I'm like, I see a whole bunch of adults that want to audit your class right now. Like, drop the details maybe in the chat because I'm like, oh, that book is so good. I want to talk about that. And see, this is all selfish. I'm just out here trying to go.
I'll definitely think we should all keep in touch and we should all trade books. I will definitely put my book list in the chat.
I would love to build on Jermaine. I loved hearing your books because I think it brings up intersectionality, right? There's not just one way to be Black. There's not just one way to be a female. There's not just one way to be one thing. And I think that's an important thing that is missing from our curriculum in the past. So how many times have we heard a story when we learn about people who look like us is often a story from struggle? How often do we hear stories that start from our joy and that start from the beauty of our communities? Or instead of learning about single individuals, let's learn about a community of folks who came together and worked towards something. And I think that if we bring that into our curriculum, that's the most important thing. Even like with our scholars, it's important we teach them how to celebrate a text, but also problematize it, right? Like we're about to read a book where of young girls, One Crazy Summer, who are going to California to visit their mother. And one thing as teachers, we like problematize it. We said, what's the good thing about the text? What's the bad thing? Man, it's showing the Black family, but they're not married. We then said, great, what else? What are things that can come up from our scholars? What else? How can we give space for them to problematize and celebrate the text? But I just love, send me your book list. I'm excited.
I saw so many snaps and claps from people. It was great. That's great. And so important too, right? Jermaine, you talking about colorism with your early students. Deidre, you mentioning the books representing who we're seeing in the classrooms, who are sitting in those chairs, Latinx, Black, white, indifferent. We are making sure that our kids are being represented in the books that we're reading. And I think that's so important. Switching gears just a little bit, Leanne, the first time I talked to you, let's talk about your district. Let's first of all, when I talked to you, you were like, you know what? I grew up in the Dot. I'm from the Dot. I love the Dot. I love working here. You were from Wyandotte County. You work in the district. Last year, 21 students in the district lost their lives, 11 due to gun violence, some due to overdoses, some due to suicides. And you had talked about it is so hard seeing someone who I was teaching in elementary school grow up, and now I have their younger sibling, and knowing that their other sibling is no longer there. Mentally, how do you handle that as a teacher? And what do those conversations look like with those students who are dealing with so much? Because many of these students, from when I was talking to the student services director, were Black and brown males.
That is correct. So how I personally handle it, first of all, is prayer. That's first and foremost. Again, it's a real situation here in Wyandotte County, and thus the initiative, Enough is Enough. Our school district made a declaration, gun violence in our community, loss of student life in our community, enough is enough. And a lot of that is because there has been a disconnect. Now, Rae, I'm gonna have to make one correction. So, been married for 25 years. Of those 24 years, been living here with my husband in Kansas City. So I'm a transplant. He's from here. He brought me here, and I've been here for a long time. But it does feel like I grew up here, because one of the first things people ask is, what school did you go to? Because that's a whole nother thing. Okay, that's a whole nother thing. And if you don't answer the question right, that could mess you up. But being here over 25 years in this community, I watched things happen. And one of those things that happened was the disconnect. There was a time where there was love for one another. Tara, you talked about that. There was that love for one another, that community responsibility for one another. And over time, disconnect happened to where now we're so disconnected that these kind of things are allowed to just kind of creep on in. And it's not until it's out of proportion till then we have to demand enough is enough. And so unfortunately, now we're in that place where we got to bring that connection back. We got to reconnect. We got to reconnect our community together with our law enforcement. We know our students in particularly, when you hear law enforcement, there's a whole lot of different feelings that come up with the African-American experience, especially males and law enforcement. So reconnecting that bridge, for one, has been one of our focuses. That's something we need to do. We need to reconnect our community, because yes, it is hard to deal with when you've taught a student in elementary, and now like I'm in the high school level, and that student is gone, but I have their sibling. And so they know I know their sibling. I was there. They remember me. And so having to have those hard conversations about why my sibling isn't here. As it was said, there's a lot of times there's feelings that we have to process ourselves before we can help our students. And that's one thing that I can say that our district has made a strong commitment to, is the mental health aspect, having the counselors in every school from preschool all the way up to high school, taking on that initiative, because we are finding, especially for our community, when you talk about mental health, usually that's something that is a stigma. And so taking that stigma out of mental health and those services that our kids so desperately need, not just our kids, but even the adults, because what goes on in this house stays in this house. It's time out for that. We do need to talk about these things. And so that's where we kind of are, Rae.
I think what's so important is to be an advocate for our students, right? Like you were talking about, Leanne. And I also want to bring in Deidre, because advocacy is so important, especially with our earliest learners. And Deidre, I know that you have been doing a lot of work, not just at the local level, but at the state level as well. What are some policies that you are really trying to highlight? And I know you mentioned a little bit earlier in the town hall, but what are some policies you want to highlight? What are things we can change at the state level?
Yeah, there's actually some small movement towards some of what Leanne just actually mentioned. So one of the challenges on the Missouri side is the volume of schools that closed, and then no shade to charter schools, because I'm a proponent of good schools. That doesn't matter to me, public, private, charter, wherever children go. But what's happened is many children travel a really long way to get to schools. And so School Smart KC and others have come together with some community-based child care and early childhood centers with the Kansas City Public School District and some local charter schools, where we are the actual provider of preschool services for those schools. And then those children matriculate into those elementary schools as an opportunity to break down the division that happens between preschool and kindergarten, and allow us to remain the experts with early childhood, and allow the schools to maintain their emphasis on kindergarten programming and up. There are some barriers in doing that, though, because in a community-based environment, we're not a LEA. So the policy surrounding, typically we don't actually have to require certification for teaching, and actually you want to have some flexibility in the early childhood space to do that, because we don't adequately fund, and so consequently we can't compete in the same way with the school district. Our retirement plans are not as robust as the public school setting would be. But again, it goes back to kind of everything that was said. Like, my early world was, I was a child welfare worker, and then I was the director of at-risk programming for the Hickman Mills School District. And the majority of time that I was working with families, it was children that didn't get that quality preschool experience that we're providing. We're like, small temper tantrums turn to big temper tantrums, that turn to juvenile detention, that turn to jail, that turn to death. I mean, being very honest, I mean, if you don't learn how to regulate, and that all happens at a really young age. And so we can do and must do better as a community to figure out how to come together in that way. The other is that about 40% of the child care providers in Missouri and Kansas are anticipated to close as a result of the pandemic, because it's a very fragile business model to begin with, and the costs to maintain being open. So we were closed for 2 months, but we've been open ever since. I could write beyond here for days talking to you about the economic and health and other challenges and stressors as associated with being open. But we're not here really for that. We're really here more to highlight and magnify Black History Month and the resilience of our community. And I think that in the realm of just highlighting the resilience, like families are showing up, children are showing up. And the one thing that I'd leave you with that we do in our environment too is that we're an arts integrated preschool. So we're exposing our children to every genre of creativity that they could ever imagine, everywhere from a local graffiti artist to the Kansas City Friends of Alvin Ailey, to the symphony, to the orchestra. Like, I don't know what they'll be interested in, but they won't know till they're exposed to that. And they get to see artists that look like them, and they get to see artists that don't look like them. And I think that is also another challenge that many school systems have, that these other outlets for children have been removed from schools in many ways, or diminished tremendously in arts programming and other things, that not all children are going to play sports. And so we need to be able to allow them to have these other opportunities to flourish.
If I can piggyback right off of what Deidre said, we're always just happy. I'm just happy to hold Deidre's purse most of the time. I'm just happy when she just let me sit next to her, But, I think back to, early on, the slide that was shown just about, the gap, right? And within that gap, right, are a number of different stories and opportunities for advocacy, right? What would it have done for, for better early childhood education, high quality pre-K for that gap? What would it do for better special education services, fully funded special education services for that gap? What would it do to have teachers who represent the students, right? Like those are all of these opportunities. And I like to, or I think I told you, I like to joke that I watch CSI, like a forensic data. Like, I'm like, well, what would have happened if this happened? Change the model. How do we do this? If we can affect violence, right? How many more students graduate? How does that impact the ACT score? The reading, it's reading. All of those things are opportunities. And I think sometimes we do get very fixated on the numbers, on the performance, on all of those types of things, without thinking about that further upstream is a point of change that we all need to be pushing and advocating and inviting people to the table, because what's served is change. Right? Our kids depend on our ability to do that, to diagnose, the shortfallings in the system. They say all the time, systems work exactly the way they are designed to work. And if they're not working for our Black and brown kids, it's time to blow it up. We gotta figure out some better, different types of things. And that takes the fortitude of people who are on this call, who are willing to try innovative, different strategies, but also stand up and be very vocal about why it's important that systems change and people start to look at how we educate kids differently. So kudos to all of y'all, because I know y'all are firebrands in every one of those spaces.
And to that point, Samara, I know we have just a little bit more, over 5 minutes left. You had mentioned the realm of possibility. When you see these numbers, it can be hard to grapple with that gap that we're seeing, which can be caused due to outside factors, whether that is poverty, whether that is attendance, whether that is a number of different things. I want to end this conversation, and I want each person to kind of talk about it. What does the realm of possibility look like? What have been some amazing things that you've seen, whether that be in your classroom with some of your colleagues? This is the reason why I'm in education, and the main message you really want our viewers to take home at the end of this town hall. So Samara, I'll let you start.
I was trying to hurry up and mute myself because I was like, I'm gonna go last. No, so Deidre mentioned a program, the Kansas City Pre-K Cooperative. I mean, it makes my heart burst. But certainly for the role, I just kind of sit at a systems level, right, and kind of sit and look at over across the region, and it is seeing that movement, right? It doesn't feel like a lot, but it is monumental in terms of what happens. And I think what gives me an incredible amount of hope is spaces like this. It is when resources, right, because resources matter, are aligned to the things that are most important. And when those things are elevated by people of color, hey, this is the issue, and we trust Black educators, Black leaders, and saying, you know what, we need to resource that issue. And I've started to see that more and more, and more of a commitment to that, and have been really happy to try and, you know, help see more work done in the advocacy and public policy space, led by people of color, right? Like that is you gotta center the voices most proximate to the issues, and to the solutions. And so that gets me up every morning, that and a lot of coffee, and a moody 13-year-old. So that does it for me.
I'm going to go down the line. So next in my line is Leanne. Leanne, your final thoughts?
The realm of possibilities. One thing that I think of is what this pandemic has allowed for all of us to become. Very resourceful, try new things, learn new things. This is the time to do that. We were forced to, but now that we've been forced to, and seeing the things that we can do, someone said it, our systems are broken. So this is a perfect time for a plan of a new system. The perfect time to plan a new system with effective outcomes, with this type of leadership that we're seeing here, with advocacy and the financing to go behind it, and the policy, of course, and like the possibilities can be endless. Realm of possibilities, and now is the time. Now is the time.
Thank you. Tara?
I think I'm just echoing what everyone else said. This is the time where you're forced to try something new. I think of like what it looks like. We had a design challenge, and we let our scholars collaborate with local artists to design the murals that are going to be on our building for generations after them. Never would I have said, we're going to design, let's let the minds of our 10-year-olds. But now they get to see, like, I have vision. They get to see that every day. And I'm sure, hopefully, their future children, if they decide to have them come to the school, they can say, I put that on the wall. I collaborated with my sisters at this school to put this on the wall to represent who we are. And I think those are the possibilities. Our youth, giving them that true space and the tools and the resources, I can't emphasize that, to really show their vision and for it to come to life.
That's great. Tara, thank you. Deidre?
No, I just am a huge believer in the power of a child's voice. You'd be amazed what a 3-year-old would say and tell you. They know what's going on around them, and the change we want to see in our world is going to come from the children that are in our schools now. And we need to elevate their voices in a way that brings hope to our community, because I think that we're all so fatigued and so discouraged. But there's more than one way that a child achieves. And I think that according to the GRE, I'm illiterate, okay? And I have a master's degree, okay? So I think that we need to like dismantle what our measure of achievement is and look more broadly at that, because it was not really designed with children of color in mind. And so I just think, and elevating the voices and really like looking at doing school completely differently so that families can be meaningful partners. They need twilight school, give them twilight school. If they want to keep their kids at home and tap in virtually from here on out, let them do that. Like we're so stuck in an old school model, like just tear it apart and do it again. But I have the luxury of running a nonprofit with a board that supports me, so I can kind of do that. But that's one of the challenges with elected school boards and the politics that are involved. Like dump the politics and just do what's right for kids. And they'll tell you what they want, because I have a freshman in high school and she's got a whole lot to say. And you know what? She walked right up to the superintendent and he listened to her. And, you know, a kid will get you motivated any day.
Absolutely. I see you nodding your head, LaCrystal. I'll let you go ahead and go next.
So for me, I think one of the most important things that we have to continue to do is advocate for systemic change. I think we need to use all of our resources, the social workers, the counselors, all the teachers, all the adults in every building to build relationships with our kids. Our kids are suspended at a higher rate than any other kids. Our kids are referred for special education higher than any other kids. Our kids are not getting what they need at a young age. So then they are getting caught up into this corrupt justice system. And our job is to keep them out of the jails, out of the prisons. Our job is to give them what they need so that the skills they need, the social emotional skills, not just education, to have access to those possibilities that you're talking about. What are the realms of possibilities? I think that the biggest thing that we need to give our kids is access and opportunity. And if we can't give them the access to get to those things and the opportunities to get there and to keep them out of jail and out of prisons and giving them the skill sets that they need to be successful, then we're not doing right by our Black and brown kids.
Thanks.
Yes, this is a very tough question, and I don't like it, but I'm gonna try. I'm gonna try to answer it. But I will say the GRE is a terrible test. No one should have to take it ever in life. So I'm in a position where I have to recognize the privilege I occupy at Pembroke, and there's not a lack of resources here as far as financial. I have great autonomy in what I teach, but there is what gives me hope, I will say, is that I am challenging students to actually interrogate who they are as people, and they're coming along for the ride. I know I have a way of, before this year, before the pandemic, I wanted, rigorous essays, 5-paragraph, analyze this passage. But now it's more, well, here's a lens to look through. Here is a lens of womanism. Go out in the world, find a text that you think meets up with these and tell me about it in your paper, which gets them more involved in the assignment as opposed to being a top-down and more so being a student-centered instruction. And actually a student gave me that idea. He's like, he wanted to do the project. I was like, give it to everybody. It's not just for you, but for everyone. So I think what gives me hope is that the students that I am engaged with have ideas, and they're willing to share their ideas with me, and I'm willing to give their ideas back to them, and we have that exchange of this educational moment. So it's heartening to see, and hopefully their papers are better for it.
Awesome, thanks. What about you, George?
For me, when I think about the realm of possibilities, I think perspectives are super important. Valuing the students' perspectives, valuing the perspectives inside of the building. I think Leanne said earlier that there's this hierarchy that we think of when we think about leadership. And Ella Baker said that strong people don't need strong leaders. And so I think it's really powerful for students to understand the value in their voice, but also work communally to ask why things work the way they do. And then when they don't work the way they should, ask why not.
I love that. And I truly cannot thank you all enough for coming on here and just being real and opening up this conversation, right? Because an hour-long conversation, we're not even scratching the surface on this. And I think it's such an important topics that we're covering, that we've covered for the past hour and 4 minutes. And again, so thank you all so much. For those that joined us on Facebook, for our viewers that joined us in this important conversation, thank you so much for joining us. We truly do appreciate it. And again, to this amazing panel, thank you. Yes, and I definitely will make sure you all get each other's emails. There were so many snaps and claps when you all were talking. And
when is the barbecue? When we getting together? What's next, y'all?
I think that's and I think it's so important to have that, those connects in people in the community to lean on with you all in education, knowing that you're not alone. So I definitely will make sure at the end of this to make sure everyone gets each other's emails, so you all are on each other's book list, curriculum, all that good stuff. So thank you.